Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Batteries Sound Bites podcast. I'm the host, Bill Binch, and I'm excited that we're going to episode 2 with Phil Fernandez, former CEO and founder of Marketo, my former boss. We had an action-packed session in our first episode with tons of stuff, so much that we ran long and we broke this into 2 sessions. I'm excited to dive back in with Phil to the second session and share more with you. Here we go.
It's so easy to get in your competitors' heads because as soon as you start to say something about a competitor, then they need to respond. And if a competitor starts to take that bait, it's all over with. What we had done is we had so gotten into their head that they had torqued their product release into being the Marketo killer. They were no longer listening to customers and building features their customers were asking for. They were listening to Marketo and building features to respond to us. They were responding to us. They were going into Gartner Group and saying, we are responding to a Marketo. It's a winning strategy every time.
I always love that Gartner story. And it's a great place to take us because this was at a critical time where, as I said earlier in the podcast, Marketo had started selling to really SMB customers, like you said, B2B SaaS companies that look just like us. But we always aspired to move up and go into the mid-market and go into the enterprise. And we'd started this move to the market. Eloqua was the gorilla at the time, and they were selling to more of the enterprise companies. But we started around this time, that motion up into the enterprise. And I remember the word deliberate being used a lot. I have a couple questions around that motion of moving from SMB to enterprise. But before I ask them, Phil, that's a topic that a tremendous amount of companies today, being founded today, are thinking about. So let me ask you the question that as a CEO who went through that, knowing that a lot of early stage companies are trying to go through that same type of path, what guidance would you give to another CEO who's thinking about embarking on that process?
The process of moving up towards the enterprise. Well, when John and I founded Marketo, we knew we always wanted to go towards the enterprise. In fact, sort of the founding idea, we worked at what was the leading MarTech company in 1999, 2000, Epiphany, that was more focused on B2C marketing, but was selling licenses to the world's largest corporations, American Express and Citibank and NASA and AT&T, and deals were $3 million and $6 million and $10 million. And the whole founding premise of Marketo was that we wanted to put that same kind of technology in the hands of mere mortals for $1,000 a month rather than $10 million software license. And so we had started with this very high performance small business kind of thing. And it was great because the flywheel and the momentum that we built was invaluable forever. And we always talked about how, we were going to be the run to 100,000 customers, not the run to 1,000 customers like enterprise companies before us. But the product was built with an enterprise core. And, my co-founder that built the tech was, along the ride through this enterprise thing. So we knew we were going to get there. And eventually it became time to start to move up into the enterprise. And you hired Pete Cowing, who was our first enterprise sales rep, who had not just sold SMB, but had some team selling skill and some enterprise selling skills. But he was game to kind of, hack away at it from below. And so we first started to just poke at slightly bigger customers and just get something a little more complex. And he pulled down our first maybe $70,000 deal or something like that I thought we were never going to see a deal of that size. It was quite wonderful. But it was, again, like talking about growing that we talked before about make each month bigger. It was, let's make each customer just a little bit bigger and a little bit more challenging. And rather than announce our new enterprise play or go off in a different market or everything else, we did it, kind of incrementally and subtly, where you and I and the team set down a plan. We were going to, just nudge a little bit towards the enterprise, make it a little more complex, just get a little bit more ready. And then I remember where you teed up and your team teed up a deal at General Electric that was going to be bigger and harder and more important. And we were still just 30, 40 people in the company. And I remember getting together and pulled the entire management team together in the room in the corner of the office and said, so we got to make a decision, folks, about whether we're going to take this deal or not. It's bigger and harder. It's our first, 6-figure deal. And we're, going to have the light of day. And it's like, GE had just done a $50 million deal with Salesforce. And so they were in the news for that and stuff. And we looked each other in the eye and said, are we ready to sign up? And we're going to lock arms and we're going to fight our way through this. And we're going to take down this deal. And I gave it a green light to get it done. And you did. And we made them wildly successful. And they, in their heyday, became one of our anchor rock customers and a big important brand in our portfolio. And it was just, and then, later we were turning up, 7, 8, 9-figure deals at Amazon and Google and Microsoft and General Electric. And, we were doing, marketing to the world's largest enterprise. But it was, again, you would never find a day, you would never find a moment, you would never find a point of time that anything changed, other than by 1 minute after the next, we fought our way harder and harder up into that enterprise, and then started to segregate the sales team and build new motions and, do all the things you got to do. Um, and what are the lessons from that? Incrementalism is important. Incrementalism is important. Momentum, trying to get into the enterprise. I see companies now that, have an amazing solution, but they've got 8 customers or 9 customers. And so nobody's ever heard of them. They don't have a lot of references. They don't have, so you don't have all the tools that you need to use to sell, like references, like momentum, like lots of customers doing variety of use cases. You end up captive to a single customer rather than being able to, invent your product and elaborate your product in lots of different directions. So I think that's sort of incremental, a little bit at a time. Always know where you're headed, never take your sight off the goal, but do it incrementally is the way to get to the enterprise. Almost always, unless you've got a product that just can't exist in any other form.
Yeah.
Just a few.
Yeah. Like I said, at the beginning of this, I remember the term deliberate being thrown around a lot, which was, I think, a derivative of the incrementalism. I remember joining Marketo and asking you, what do you measure success? Being the biggest company in revenue, being the most customers, like what is, and I remember you saying, I want to be the best marketing software platform for marketers. And I was like, okay, I love the abstractness of it, but also that it was everything. It was small, it was large, it was near, it was far. And that was, I think, one of those deliberate things inside of Marketo that we did was we knew we wanted to go up market. We knew we wanted to go international, and we knew we wanted to become a multi-product company or a platform. And all 3 of those things are what I think any founder today probably also wants to do. And my advice, always talking with them, is, look, wonderful, let's aspire to do that, but let's be thoughtful and let's go figure out what we're going to do. Because if we try doing all 3 of those at once, it's really, really hard.
Yeah. It's, that to me is one of the neat things, my degree's in history. I'm a historian. I think I play the long game. I think about long-term strategies. I studied the start of the Cold War in 1940-45, U.S.-Soviet relations, and the long game that's played out. You can still study that long game to this day. So if anything, my brain kind of works in those ways, but it's quite remarkable. The founding, the original origin story, if you will, for Marketo was I had this amazing coffee up with a forestry analyst at the time at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, and had this aha moment about what the company was going to be, and raced down to Palo Alto and pounded out the company's original business plan that talked about this deliberate move to the enterprise, talked about being the best for marketers, talked about building a brand, talked about, and I went back to read that thing like 5 years later. It was like we just built that business from that day. And it was like that degree of, planning and deliberateness, which you talked about. But the other thing that's also one of my, key management things is I'm crappy at strategic planning. I'm crappy at long range planning. I don't want to talk about what we're going to do next year. I want to look at the where we are in the playing field today and make the right decisions today about what to do next. And so I have these very, very 2 almost directly opposed management philosophies that I've led with. This one of have a long-term vision, highly deliberate long-term strategy. And number 2, do not get yourself locked into long-term decisions because, life changes all the time and you got to make the now decision, not some other decision. And so to me, when I talk about this deliberateness and I talk about this long-term thinking, it's always super important for me to say is, do not mistake that for getting locked into a plan. You
Right.
gotta play the hand you're dealt or the cards, whatever metaphor you want.
Good advice. Good advice for founders. Let's transition to culture. So much here, but I'll give you a couple of prompts to think about. Sales and marketing working together and collaborating. An in-office culture, very important to the early days of Marketo. I think the fact that you, across the entire time frame and horizon of Marketo, you could have sat anywhere in the building, over with engineering, over with finance, but you always sat on the sales floor. Um, some of your like ideas, Phil, around the cultural build of an organization.
Gosh, I don't know. This just is that's such a vast, such a vast territory. Well, culture is everything, and it's just fascinating. Number one, being a student of culture and realizing that culture happens and culture can be built, and you need to tend to it. I would say that, boy, what to say? I mean, this is such a complex topic for me because I practically probably destroyed Marketo for negatives about the culture. I can be extraordinarily demanding. I'm demanding of myself, but that demanding of myself turns into demands of others. I can get, upset when things aren't going well. I think, super good at like not turning upsetness at ad hominem attacks or personal attacks on people. But if I'm really upset about a problem, it can sure sound like I'm upset to a person. And I, certainly, put some people into bad places. And so I got to live the lesson of success at Marketo and trying to create a culture of loving the customer, holding ourselves to high standards, holding ourselves, each of us, to accountability. Um, but also, got to learn the lessons of cultures can be too hard and not nurturing enough. And, if everything is always about, you know, taking the next hill and not stopping and smelling the roses a little bit. So for me, Marketo was the most amazing journey of studying and learning culture and softening myself while building a very hard edge and a hard core and a demanding core and an accountable core. And I think the combination of the mutual accountability that we all held ourselves to has left a whole bunch of people to leave Marketo and go on to say it was the best time of their lives, to find incredible next gigs, multiple CFOs in the world that came out of Marketo,
Yeah.
multiple heads of marketing, multiple CEOs, multiple founders. The degree of success of leaders that we produced because of creating a set of people who were battle hardened, well-trained, deeply cultured leaders, is one of the highest pride points. So I don't know what to say. You talked about sitting on the sales floor. Um, I I've never seen anything like the energy that the sales floor, meaning, salespeople sitting on the phones, talking to customers, doing deals, signing up deals. Scott Edmonds, our first sales rep, would finish the deal and do that, and then would be on to his next deal. And I took energy like you would not believe by being able to sit there. I could be having a bad day. Things could be bad at home. It could be whatever, and hearing a couple of calls go well, it was just like a buzz. But I needed to be there because it, I learned from it. I heard from it. I got information from it. I got energy from it. We all did. And that was amazing. The fact that we were an in-office culture, I don't have any idea how sales teams learn today. I just don't even know how it happens. Sure, we had sales enablement and training and stuff, but the way great salespeople got to be great salespeople in Marketo was they came to work at Marketo, they sat next to a great salesperson, they listened to them do their calls,
Yeah.
they emulated them, and pretty soon they were like figuring out their own trick, and then they were the oldsters 6 months later to teach the next new person about what to do, and that was really pretty incredible. So again, we've used this term now over and over, the flywheel of a team of 20 people sitting on the floor making the 21st better and the 22nd better and the 35th better was amazing. And then when we had to plant our second office in Atlanta or in Dublin or where, as we built sales offices, we did that same thing to get scale, to get critical mass, to have people sit together and learn from each other. It was an essential part of the Marketo culture, and then ultimately just creating an environment where, everybody could win, create an environment where a whole bunch of people won. It was great.
You're totally right about the leaders. I mean, I think of Matt Hines and Tim Strickland. Matt at Amplitude, Tim at ZoomInfo went on to be, CROs of publicly traded companies. Dave Kane and Heidi Bullock went on to be CMOs of great companies. Steve Sloan went on to be a CEO. Nick Bonfiglio, multiple time founder and CEO. You mentioned the CFOs, Igor Beckerman
Igor
and
and
Brian
Brian,
Kenyon,
yeah.
going out to be CFOs of companies that had big exits or went public. It was a little bit of a factory from that. But I, you know, the thing that's interesting to me is you just mentioned something there about like the learning. If we look at how times have changed now technology certainly improved, right? Like, in 2008, quality of doing a video call wasn't near what it was today. We've had post-COVID work from home. We have AI. We have a lot of things there. If you were creating a team today, do you think you'd go back to the in-office culture to try and drive that type of learning that you talked about?
Oh, 100%. I think, there's two themes that are just, you know, radically at odds with each other, going on here. One is, the benefits of being all in one place, and we'll talk about that. And the other is that, if you're building a business, I had the luxury to, grow up much of my early part of the career in Silicon Valley, where it really was where everything was happening. But, the tech industry is so large now that anybody that doesn't think there's a global war for talent, or a global search for talent, or whatever
Right.
metaphor, if you don't want to use a military one, to find talent, which of course wants to think about virtual offices and people, hiring the best talent anywhere, and the like. But the degree of education that you get by being together in an office, the learning, the energy, the serendipitous moments, the ability to talk together, to just have moments of communication. For me or other leaders to get up and manage by walking around, to walk into somebody's office and have a quick question. And there's like new generation products being built, to try to, do this, well better than Zoom, or whatever, that are maybe pretty interesting. But they don't overcome time zones. They don't overcome people still, trying to work together and collaborate on things. So I'm very, very big believer in office situations, because I think the serendipity moments and the cultural learning experiences and the communication options are just, overwhelm. And then, if there's a, AI engineer that's in, Costa Rica, or Poland, or wherever, that you got to go figure out how to get them as part of the team, and make it work. Sure, you make exceptions and do those things, but you got to be together as a team to succeed. The power of being together is a very human thing.
Great lessons here. Great lessons. On that, let's talk about the topic of amplification. I think uh, Marketo, like a lot of software companies, started creating our own user summit, the Marketo Summit, where we every year invite people into the Bay Area and we'd host them for some type of event. But there was a key change that I think was a moment of inflection for Marketo, where we went from thinking about ourselves to making this much bigger about how do we affect the marketing community as a whole, not just our users. And that was a shift from us running a Marketo Summit to suddenly becoming the marketing nation. Marketo Summit, it's about us, to marketing nation. It's about anybody in marketing. I think it was a key moment of amplification, and I think there's great learnings to take away from it for our listeners. So, would love to tap into some of your recollections on that.
Well, amplification, and building a genuine brand. And, there's like, you can read about, if you follow, current MarTech, and, the best people doing and working in the field, my co-founder, who still is, and many others, you'll find all sorts of discussion um, about how MarTech doesn't work anymore, but what you have to do is build a brand, and you need to focus on that. And that was always at the center of Marketo. It started, from the early days, when we did, logo design and color design, and John and I, picked purple, and we decided that the whole marketing nation was going to bleed purple one day. And, we rallied around that. And that was merely a tool to have a totem or a symbol that you could start to rally around. And then we started to rally around, the notion that we were going to teach people how to be successful, not just build software. But, as we were turning out software, John and his team were building, what became this amazing series of, dummies guides to how to do various marketing techniques. And we would put that stuff out there for free, and make it available, sometimes gated and sometimes not. You can argue about that now, but they were pieces that were genuine. They were not fluff pieces. They were genuinely trying to teach people about how to be better marketers. And so we started to build a brand impression that we were not only building good software, not only easy to deal with, but we were actually trying to educate people to be better at their jobs. And then, as we started to try to get together the, Marketo Summit, because we saw how Dreamforce was this huge event that was so powerful in the annual cycle. Salesforce, and turn out 30,000 people would come to San Francisco and to Moscone to go to it. So we wanted to replicate that. So we started to kind of build a summit that was first 30 people and then 100 people, and then ultimately the last one was 6 or 8,000 people in Vegas when we kind of outgrew the Bay Area. And that was, again, this incremental, kind of put one foot in front of another and make things grow. It was amazing. But what we did is we built a brand that was all about the marketer and the customer. We were educating them. And then we came up very intentionally, and I don't actually know who it was. It was one of the amazing marketers on my team and our team that came up with this term marketing nation, which was about attempting to say, again, to be an advocate for our customer, an advocate for the job description, an advocate for marketers who have always been a little bit put upon that, hey, we're your people, we're voting for you. And I would start, I got up on stage. I remember the marketing Nation Summit that had, I had Hillary Clinton as my guest, and I had Beth Comstock from GE on the second day, who gave up her first day keynote in favor of Hillary Clinton, where she was getting ready to run for president back in 2015 or 2014. So it was a big thing. But the way I started my summit was calling out people who had promotions in our customers. And I had the marketing team would figure out 8 or 10 or 15 people that were in the audience that had received promotions in their jobs for what they were doing to build great marketing. And I would talk about how people were building careers, were getting promoted, were making more money, were earning prestige in there because they were being great marketers using Marketo technology, but mostly because of them. And by being that kind of a genuine advocate for your customer, for their job, for what they're trying to accomplish, to show the kind of empathy that we were showing to our customers, and to show that in everything we did, it again was this self-reinforcing flywheel where people wanted to be associated with us because like we were just making each other better. And it was very deliberate, very conscious, but was from such a positive place and such a good place in our hearts of what we were doing that it just worked. And trying to build a brand without that degree of empathy, without that degree of genuineness, without that degree of advocacy, those are all the kinds of things. And if you think it's just colors or a good logo or whatever, people, building brand is an all-consuming everything thing, and it's the only way to win as a tech company then and today. And it's something that it's the thing we got right at Marketo of all things.
My memory of that was, someone gave this analogy, and it always stuck with me, is we went from being a planet orbiting the sun, with Salesforce at the time, of being a partner of theirs, to suddenly we were the sun, and there were a bunch of things orbiting us. There were service vendors, there were ISVs, and then there were people that were, you said, attending this conference, not necessarily because like Marketo was top of mind, because they were looking to advance themselves and become a better marketer. And I always loved that analogy. It really summed it up for me.
I think that, I think that really came right out of my head as an analogy. It's super important to me. This notion, from the early days, one of the things that Marketo did, and is also a rule that I think, is going to inform as companies, grow and do what they do in the AI age and everything that we're in today. Marketo had the attribute that we created data that didn't exist anywhere else. It was inside Marketo. And so we were a platform. We had staying power. And so the fact that customers had data inside Marketo that didn't exist anywhere else was the start of that idea that we were a sun. We weren't just orbiting something else. We were, we had some mass and some gravity that existed there. We had this amazing, again, incremental build of how do we have partners start to orbit us. One of the earliest things that I put down as a rule for Marketo was what I called the 2020 rule, was that we were never going to do more than 20% of all of the services that were happening in the Marketo ecosystem. Whether that's Accenture doing services or some small boutique, we would never take more than 20% of it, and it would never be more than 20% of our P&L. Now, it never got to 10% of our P&L, as it turned out, and we probably never got to 10% of the services, but the 2020 rule was still the rule. And that idea was that we were going to make a network of partners grow up around us. And in fact, one of the things we did that customers, I see other companies today balk at doing, is we would subcontract a bunch of services out to our smaller partners. And instead of hiring somebody, we'd give the Pedowitz group, a subcontract, to put on a Marketo badge and go act in our shoes. My CFO would hate it. Fred would just hate it because he's like, boy, that's a way to double down on expensive services. But it's like, well, wait a minute, but they've now got skills and they're going to now turn around and try to go sell that person to a Marketo person someday. And so all of a sudden that was somebody that had their own interest in making us better because
Yep.
we had helped train their staff on our dime, but now it was on their dime. And that worked right up to the fact that, Accenture put a whole team for the, hospital and healthcare industry behind us because we had helped them, start to orbit our sun with trained resources. And it was, again, a positive feedback loop. So that notion that we were going to build an ecosystem of partners, the Marketo, what was it called? What was our app? Marketing Nation, right? It was like the most successful after Salesforce that we built. Robin Bardoli built it for us, and Mike Stocker and stuff. Anyway, the point of all that is how incredibly successful we were at building this set of people who were orbiting around our star, all of whom we were making successful, all of whom were making us successful, again in this virtuous cycle. And now this is like, what, the fifth time probably in this discussion that we've talked about a virtuous cycle of feedback loops that build on each other to make us more successful.
And wind in your sails. No question.
Works every time,
No question. Shifting over to product expansion and innovation, another topic that I think a lot of founders are always thinking about. We had the core Marketo lead management, the second version of it, really the streets for production level in early 08. In 09, we released our first add-on product, Marketo Sales Insight. And then a short time after that, like a year later, we dropped our third leg of the stool, the Marketo Revenue Cycle Analytics product. And I remember Eddie Nguyen, one of our early employees who in those days ran pre and post sales. We had this term we would use in front of customers: furious pace of innovation. Furious pace of innovation. I always liked that term. We go out there and say, like, why Marketo? And, talk about the problems we solve for the customers. But we talk about, like I said, some of those other things, like the ability to free trial, transparent pricing, good to do business with, and furious pace of innovation. So I'm curious how you think about that with companies that you work with today. Like, how do you think about innovation? How do you factor in the complexities of going from single product to multi-product?
Yeah. It's one of the hardest motions, and it's just, I spend a lot of time with the companies I work with today on this topic. We were, fast innovators. We did get to multiple products pretty fast. Probably our fourth product we failed on pretty completely, while the first three went pretty well, and we'll talk about that lesson as well. But the root of that lesson, number one, is that TAMs are never anywhere near as big as companies think they are. Total addressable market, or whatever kind of phrase that you want to use for that these days. And even while you can look and do a TAM number and say that's a $5 billion TAM, as soon as you start to get to 100 million or 200 million, you started to pick the low hanging fruit, and you start to see ability to not quite be as rapid in kind of sales and go to market effectiveness, because you start to do the easiest business. And so it is always important to be looking at the next source of revenue, the next source of business. And I think companies get too late thinking about how to get to multiple products or to multiple sources of TAM. And like our very first product was designed to not be sold into marketing seats, but be sold into sales seats. Very similar buyer, probably in fact bought by marketing, but sold for a different use case. And so it got at a very different pool of money that was utterly untapped by Marketo. And so it was very successful because it was able to increase our average revenue per customer in a substantial way. Very, very successful. And it felt, very much the same sales motion. And the third product as well. We busted our pick a little bit on the fourth, which was a real-time recommendation. It was a company we bought, a very, in fact, great company. And I would call the acquisition a phenomenal success. But the product itself turned out to have a slightly different buyer and a slightly different budget and a slightly different buying metabolism. And I've learned this lesson before in my career multiple times, and darn it if I didn't just make that mistake yet again, which was that, we had a product that just, slightly different buyers. So the sales skills didn't quite match, and the marketing messages didn't quite resonate. And so we had a separate sales team that had a separate quota that was selling to the separate buyer, and nothing worked with that efficiency. And that is remarkably hard. And I see company after company that starts to embark on multi-product expansion that just don't do the pick and shovel work to look at the sales motions, to look at the details of the buyer, to look at the details of the budget, and think it's just going to be like their last sale and they just, give their salespeople more to sell. And if you don't really understand the dynamics of the go-to-market motion and the day-to-day life of the sales rep and what the customer interaction is like, it is just a recipe for failure as much as it's a recipe for success. One of the hardest plays for any mid-sized company trying to get into the billion-dollar scale to pull off. Great,
Agreed.
crazy one to fail at.
Agreed. I'm glad you called out like matching up sales and marketing and the collaboration there, the different buyers and the TAM, because I think those are all key elements of thinking through that. Like I said earlier, you know, being deliberate was really drilled into me in Marketo. Like I remember back in November of 2009. So we'd been in market for just about a year and a half. And I went over to London to go evaluate the international market. And, I went over there and I met with our customers. I met with a few prospects. And this is a time we were spending, I think, $0 on marketing or trying to generate demand over there, but we've just gotten some customers. And so I met them, I met our prospects, I met with a few partner potentials, even met with a few people that I might want to hire in case we decide to expand. And I came back all excited and I had a trip report for you. And I was like, Phil, look at all this stuff, like all the demand that we have over there. And I came home and you said, Bill, I missed you. I said, well, that's sweet. I missed you too. That was nice. Hope you had a nice Thanksgiving. But let me tell you about this trip and like the opportunity. And you're like, no, I missed you. It made me realize that if we go to Europe at this stage, do we own a segment? Do we own a space in the Americas, which is our core market? And I was like, well, no. You're like, so the missing you is I'm going to miss you a lot because you're going to be over there 5-6 times over the next year if we have to build out that team. And Bill, I just worry that might be the tail of the dog right now and not the dog. So why don't we pause the expansion ideas? Let's be deliberate. Let's focus back here on this market and do something really good. We're about to roll out a new product here. Like I said, like it was 2009, we rolled out 2. We were about to roll out a third one. And why don't we focus on getting that right? And I remember I was chagrined because, the growth guy, I wanted to go build an office over in London somewhere, but it was a smart move because 2 years later when we went, we were a bit of a late mover in going there, but we absolutely owned a category here in the US. We were known as if you were a small or mid-market company and you were buying market automation, you go call Marketo at those stages. And that goes back to that being deliberate. And it's being deliberate about whether you change segments, whether you go internationally or expanding your product set.
You even followed one of my deliberate pieces of advice in that, which says you were working on the Europe expansion. I told you ought to go hire your first European MD and fire him so that you could hire the second one because everyone fires their first European MD, and which was meant to be completely tongue in cheek and ironic and humorous, but also to have a grain of
True.
truth that it's like every company fails the first time they do that, and you went and took that to heart and exactly did that, um, which is fun, which is in fact funny enough. But in fact, because we had waited a little bit and we grew up a little bit and we had a brand, we were able to attract the gentleman who built, Salesforce's European operation, who left Salesforce and came and did it for Marketo. Just extraordinarily talented individual that had, experience at that kind of scale and connections at that
Yep.
kind of scale in Europe. And if we had done it 2 years earlier, we would have had somebody nobody had ever heard of doing it. And, as a result, we made it. We did each one of those in a deliberate way at the right time with the right friends.
100% true. I mean, I remember going in Fergus Gloucester, the person in Dublin, and Fukuda-san over in Japan. I think, 2 former pro level Salesforce folks, people that had built the organizations in their respective markets that we were able to go and attract. And like you said, if the timing was right, gone earlier, we would have hired somebody who knows how that would have turned out. But we were able to go hire just amazing people, which is a great place to take us to the balance between humility and confidence. And I'll set this up this way. I think Marketo was always striving to be humble. Like let's under promise and over deliver. Let's have a very high customer focus. Let's make sure our customers are swinging from the rafters, excited to work with us. But I do remember there was an interesting stage. It was shortly after we went public where you came in and you said to the team, this humility play has worked really well for our growth, but there's also a level of confidence that we have to be able to go and show and demonstrate out in the market. So I'd like all of you, and I'm already saying to the executive team, I'd like all of you to go find a board to go sit on. I'd like you to go on speaking tours and go speak as experts in your domains at conferences and at events and things like that, because we probably need to grow our own professional persona in there. Any sharings around that?
Well, I mean, in some sense, there's obviously a theme running through our whole discussion here. This one of humility and confidence of say what you're going to do, do it, or think about what you're going to do it, and then say what you did. Walk the walk and then talk the talk, kind of thing, and always be sure that you're leading with substance and not leading with noise, because that's how you build trust and that's how you build a great brand and the like. But one thing is when you're a $30 million company or a $10 million company or a $100 million company thinking about a public offering maybe, or, something like that, you are still nobody in the grand scheme of things. It might feel like you've come a long way, and it's pretty neat because people are starting to hear about you and investors are getting ready to write a check for a public offering or whatever. But in the grand scheme, you're still pretty much nobody, and other than your echo chamber has heard of you. And so that's a time in some ways for humility. It's a time again for, doing and then taking the credit for the stuff you do. But we were now a successful public company. We were kind of getting close to $300 million and and 2014 ARR. That's have more than half $500 million in ARR in today's terms. And we were an industry leader. And so, there's a critical transition where industry leaders aren't, they don't hide in the corner. They don't, only, they lead and they make noise and they, bring people around with them, and they use momentum on a grand scale. So it was time for all of us to kind of step out and start to reap the rewards of what we had earned, and to start to play on a grander stage. And when you're, I had already realized had sat on several multi-billion-dollar a year software boards and realized how it's just all different when you're much bigger. You're using debt to, finance acquisitions, and, all sorts of things are different in much larger software companies. And so, you realize that we hadn't learned anything about what being a big software company was all about. We were still a tiny software company. So it was time after that public offering for all of us to grow the next set of knowledge, the next set of wisdom, the next set of experiences. I brought in several outside executives that had worked in much larger companies
Hmm.
because, you don't know what you don't know. So we needed to get, more of that kind of blood around the table. And it's again, part of this growth journey. But once you've earned your stripes, you don't hide what you've earned. You gotta be proud of what you earned, and you gotta, make everything that you've earned pay back. It's all a payback loop. And so, you're quite right that we all then spread our wings and started to spread our story to a much wider audience at the time.
Agreed. There's so much to cover. I do want to take us to a little bit about current day and time, and around the state of marketing and sales, and as well as around the input of AI. But before we leave the walk down memory lane here, Marketo, favorite Marketo story. Is there something that comes to mind for you?
There were so many amazing moments, but in some sense, that Gartner discussion where Kim Collins said, "Phil, your competitor was in, and you talked about customers and they talked about you." That was the day that I knew we had won. And if there was a moment when the first 6 years of the company was being little and tiny and hard scrabble and fighting for everything and never knowing whether we were going to make it, what was still a small market, was pretty astounding.
I think that's a super cool story about, because it's an arc of the company. And knowing you'd win. I remember you coming back from that and telling the story and saying, we won. And we were like, what are you talking about? And you're like, we won. And it's two words, but it just resonated. Obviously people inside of Marketo, pretty incredible. There's so many stories, but Scott Edmonds, who's an incredible software executive out there today, he was our number one, first sales rep hired. And then he was number one for, I think, the first 3 or 4 years of
Score.
Marketo.
Yeah.
And then he raised his hand and moved to Dublin, Ireland to open that office and was the number one rep there. And then again raised his hand to move to Australia and open the office there and was number one rep. So I think he ran something like 6 or 7 years straight of being the number one rep inside of the company. I think that just makes me smile. Nick Valdeparis, our first SDR in the organization, now a vice president over at another battery ventures company, Pendo. I remember he was an up and comer. He wanted to be a sales rep really bad, was kept trolling me of, Bill, put me in, I can do this. I was like, hey, hold down. But meanwhile, to help train him, I'd let him take leads that were coming in from outside the US and say, like, look, if you can close something, great. He'd close a few deals. And I remember he came in one day and he like dropped a piece of paper down on my desk and was like, check this out. And it was not just a deal that he closed outside the US, but it was the biggest deal at the company size at that, the biggest deal in the company history at that moment. And I remember we went crazy and very quickly promoted him up to be a sales rep shortly after that. So I think like those were certainly fun. And I think you and I are both fine diners and lovers of good cuisine. We had the burger wars. You had your place, Jeffrey's in San Mateo, Jack's, and we would compete on who had the better burger. And you and I'd go and have burger taste offs and stuff like that. Those were pretty fun ideas.
That's how competitive I am, Bill, is I'm right there about Jack's and Jeffrey's, and, you're just wrong. And it's, Jeffrey's is better.
I think I came around to the quality of that being actually better. It was just a fun thing though, to go and compare and arm wrestle over. So that's great. All right. So let's shift, state of sales and marketing today. I know you've posted on this. You and I have talked about this. Love to have you share more broadly here about some of the observations that you've seen and what's happening today.
Boy, it's fascinating. The degree of change that's happened in go-to-market from when, Marketo was, T2, D3, super fast grower, rapid shot to IPO and continued growth. And, even inside Adobe, Marketo's a multi-billion-dollar business and, in some ways doing fine. But old technology that hasn't moved very long. And more to the point, the market has moved tremendously. Marketo, in some sense, it's the thing that launched us into all the success was Google AdWords and this amazing new advertising medium that was created that we were able to ride the coattails of and make much more productive and, elaborate into, whole go-to-market mechanisms that served lots and lots and lots of companies well. But those were, in the words of my co-founder, and he's got a great new marketing company he's working on, John Miller, he talks about the tragedy of the commons, the same thing that, you can have a common area in the middle of your town square, but if everybody wants to have their sheep graze that, they eat up all the grass, and then nobody has a town square anymore because everybody overabused it. And his, basic note is that everybody was sending so much email and doing so much marketing with tools like Marketo that it saturated every customer so that there's no longer, nothing works. And everybody was producing so much, search optimized content onto Google that, you couldn't find anything. And then all of that is, of course, changed completely now where, Google hardly, does AdWords and the blue links are gone. And, the whole premise has changed and search optimization has changed. And so all the fundamental foundations that Marketo and the other companies that founded MarTech have sort of kind of ceased to exist. The attention span is tuned out and everything else. So as a result, there's a new generation of marketing tech companies that are growing up, which is pretty interesting. And with AI, where AI can learn from customer behavior, and with reinforcement learning, where AI can, figure out what works and doesn't work in terms of making offers, we're going to find out that a new generation of MarTech companies will grow up here in the next couple of years that will unleash the same kind of productivity gains and things that Marketo did, and some great companies will be built. But it's very strange watching because there's a whole bunch of stuff that was pioneered that also are getting, like, babies are being thrown out with the bathwater. One of the things that just like amazes me is, like, if you read LinkedIn now about MarTech, you'll hear about how MQLs are evil. They're bad. It's the tyranny of MQLs. John talks about the gumball machine, and everybody's MQLs started out with a really simple premise, which is the salespeople have to create pipeline for themselves, and salespeople are practitioners of a skilled craft, of persuading people to, come along and buy. And you got to get up in the morning. You got to figure out who your next customer is going to be. So you can either get on the phone and you can make a cold call to somebody you've never heard of and that's never heard of you, or you can make a call to an MQL. It's somebody who's, you got a phone number and they've maybe raised their hand and maybe answered an email. It's not like you ever claim that that MQL is going to buy from you tomorrow. It's not that they're the best thing since sliced bread. It's just better than nothing, and we never promised that an MQL was better than that. But now they become demonized because somehow they were supposed to be these magic things that whatever. And so we've let a set of very basic things like the best marketing is going to do is persuade people a little bit. The best we're going to do with all the campaigns we run is bias, the scale in our favor a little bit. It's not magic. It's just hard work. And we think that there's some kind of easy bullet now to be built, or some kind of easy technique, or some kind of thing that if we just did it, we would return to the heyday of, the easy days. And, it's not true. It takes work. Sales is a very, very complex craft of persuading people. It's a craft that I fear that we're losing the skill, because people think you just come in and, you get coached with Gong and marketing, produces leads for you, and, you take orders and AI SDRs do all your work. I got to tell you, all of that is just fictitious and false. People buy from people. Empathy still matters. Persuasion still matters. Alignment with customers still matters. Offering the best solution at the best price still matters. And so we're in a very, very weird world that got overamped with way too much money going into sales with the ZERP era, way too many big investments. AI has created an illusion that things happening with AI that's not happening with Gen AI. We demonized a bunch of stuff that we discovered 10 years ago in MarTech that's really are good lessons that if we would just, relearn the old lessons from before rather than decide we were all wrong before and just figure out how to adapt for the modern era, there's going to be a great new set of technologies. But there's a cataclysm right now of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and throwing a bunch of good stuff out. And it's sort of a shame because, when you throw out a bunch of good learnings with bad, it takes a long time to relearn and reinvent, but we're prone to do that. We do that in our societies and our cultures and our, you know, worlds and our politics and all that stuff. So, this too will pass.
I get asked that question. In fact, I'm speaking on a panel next week, and the prompts that they sent over were, is AI the end of sales as we know it? And I had a similar answer to you, which was just simply like, look, just not even AI technologies, but technologies. Like, I don't have to deal with a human today to go buy laundry detergent, right? I can do it on Amazon. It comes to
Yeah,
my
yeah,
house, and it's great. It's made things easier. But when you think about anything that's considered, anything that's complex, anything that's relationship driven, and to me, relationship driven is something that's probably not just a transactional sale like buying detergent, but is something that goes on for years. When you think about things that have integrations or setups or APIs that connect together, there's probably people involved in the mix there. But now I'm really excited by some of the AI technologies that are coming out. I think that it is going to reshape the way that supply chain of marketing to sales to customer success, that whole go-to-market umbrella is going to work. And so I agree with you. I think there's going to be some really exciting new tools that come out that really, I think, inspire and drive productivity gains like you talked about.
yep, yep. Yeah, I mean, I'm, super pro AI and tremendously excited. And it's one of the great waves of, technology transformation that I'll have been lucky enough to see in my long career. And it's going to be, potentially bigger and more transformative than anything else. But, people do still buy from people. It is not so simple as, gather all the information, sitting in front of your, favorite AI and make a decision. People still are open to persuasion, and great sales matters as much today as ever, whether you're buying a car or whether you're buying a, piece of software or whatever you're buying. And, the more things change, the more they stay the same. If there's ever a learning about life that I've learned over my history training in my career, is that's true. And so, you know, sales still matters and marketing still matters, and people still buy from people, and there's still going to be great companies built, and AI is going to change everything, and it's still going to all be the same.
Well, great place to coast us into the garage there. So, Phil, I want to thank you for taking a lot of time. Obviously, we spent an hour and a half here going over a lot of history, but trying to apply some lessons of what we learned from that. to new founders, and then also some thoughts moving forward. So appreciate you spending the time with me today.
You bet, Bill. I got to say, I've been doing this for, I don't know, I came out of, I was at Stanford my senior year into Silicon Valley in 1981. So whatever that is, that's 44 years ago. And have had, a chance to work with, the CEO of, Snowflake and the chairman of the computer science department at Stanford. And I've worked with just, the list of amazing people, the collaboration you and I built, those years ago, and the specialness of the magic that happened with our collaboration. It's one of the special things of a career. And so I just want to take this minute when we're doing this to thank you for being part of just one of those special things in a career.
It's fantastic. I've said this, I think, several times publicly, but outside of, I think, my father, Phil, like, of any coach, teacher, or mentor I've had, like, that the impact that you made was profound. So like, Marketo professionally branded me as something and launched me to that next stage. And you talked about it earlier, where we went from the stage of having to spread our wings and grow. And I just look at, like, the learnings, the people. I mean, we named a lot of them here today, that I got to work with. Like, we didn't name Sanjay, who was our long-term CMO, or Jason, who ran customer. Just some of the people I got to work alongside, learn from, and see and pick up skills, was just an amazing journey. So really fun to have been a part of it.
It's all about people.
It is. All right. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks.